Welcome to the next revision session. This time we are looking at the diverse places unit of paper 2, and this session is going to focus down on inquiry question 1 of diverse places. So let's begin. So this unit started with a fairly broad look at varying population structures, in particular looking at the UK. And there was three things that you looked at in the first couple of lessons. You explained the patterns relating to the population in the UK, how it's changed over the years. You then compared the population makeup of different areas of the United Kingdom. And then you started to look at future challenges that a varied, growing, declining, changing population may cause on the United Kingdom. So what you started to look at first of all was a prediction. What would you suggest the pattern has been in the last 200 years in the UK? So you'd have had a discussion in the classes, and you'd have come up with some ideas of how the UK's population had changed over time. You'd have then looked at this very simple graph, look at figure 1, looking at residents of the England and Wales from 1801 to 2011. Now this is from census data. And you can clearly see there that the UK or England and Wales population has grown over time since 1801 quite steadily up to 2011. Now, what you'd have then discussed and analysed was these questions in the black box. Suggest how it might look in the future and the impacts that it will have. Analyse what challenges this pattern will have had back in time, currently and in the future. And also explain why the pattern in figure 1 exists. Why has the UK's population increased since 1801 to 2011? You'd have then looked at another set of data, a very simple set of data this time. So you've got places down the left-hand side, England and Wales average, and then you focus down on two particular areas, the Tower Hamlets borough of London and East Devon. Now we selected those two particular regions for a reason. One being an urban inner city area and one being a rural area, which is East Devon. And we looked at the percentage of white British living in each of those areas, and then the England and Wales average, the percentage of mixed people in those areas, the percentage of Asian or Asian British. So Asian people will be those that weren't born in the UK. Asian British will be those who are tied to the ethnicity and culture of Asian, but are born in Britain. And the same for percentage black or black British and the percentage Chinese. And you'd have analysed this table of data quite extensively because when you first look at it, it looks very simple. But behind this data lies lots of information, lots of reasons for the differences in these figures. Now, we would have linked this into the key term of demographic, and it's vital that you understand that term, demographics, which is the structure of the population. And we'd have posed this statement, this question to you. The population demographic in the UK is consistent across the whole country. Can you agree with this statement and why? And you'd have looked at that set of data and you'd come up with some reasons why it could be classed as consistent and why it definitely isn't consistent. And you use the data and the locations to back up your points. So we then started to look at some basic introductory information regarding England's changing population. Now, not the United Kingdom, just England. And many of you didn't know that England is Europe's most densely populated country. It is quite a small country, but it has a high population, with a population density over 4 times higher than France. And that shocked for a fair few of you. Then we looked at the vague urban areas of England. So looking at areas of 10,000 people plus. And now urban areas are home to 89% of the population in England. So our population in England is predominantly urban. However, they only take up 7% of the land area. And that says a lot about the density, the number of people per kilometre squared. This means that only 11% of the population live in the remaining 93% of rural countryside. So therefore, that statement is saying that the countryside areas are sparsely populated in comparison to the urban. And there you go, suggesting that rural England is not necessarily an attractive proposition to live in. at the moment. But as you know, throughout this unit, things started to change. Then you looked at this, the population size in the UK had gone up over the last 10 million, over 10 million people in the last 50 years. And that showed from that first graph, with the fastest rate of increase being in the last 15 years. So something more recent is happening to England's and the UK's population. You then started to delve into a comparison where you started to look at these two areas of Tower Hamlets and East Devon. Not a majorly detailed comparison, but a very simple comparison of the Tower Hamlets urban area and the East Devon rural area. You'd have completed a very simple case study sheet where you had some resources to use to compare and contrast the two different areas. And then you'd have looked at why the changes in these two areas have occurred. And it came down to these major factors. So London and the Tower Hamlets, the changes that you'd have explored were firstly a result of migration, of historical war in London, the changing economy of London and the size of the economy, the number of jobs available, and looking at the social aspect, looking at life expectancy of people living in cities, and then job opportunities. In contrast, Devon, you looked at the factors of retirement, where older people tend to migrate out of cities to live in countryside areas such as Devon. You looked at the lack of services in a rural area such as Devon. You looked at the increase of the UK tourism industry in places such as Devon. And then, broadly speaking, you looked at the theory of urban to rural migration, not rural to urban, but urban to rural in this case. And then looked at the factor of increasing second home ownership in places such as Devon. And these were the main reasons, factors, if you like, that lie behind the characteristics and the changes that have occurred in both Tower Hamlets in London and the rural Devon area. And then we put another exam question to you. Again, you've got that set of data, same set of data as before, and it's a 4-mark question. You could get something like this in your exams using figure 1, which is the table of data, and then we throw in this figure 2. And if you have a look at figure 2, it's a choropleth map. And there you've got the color coding on the scales there. The dark areas is where you've got a higher percentage increase in population in those regions of the United Kingdom. So using figure 1 and figure 2, identify patterns of how population differs across the UK. And we discussed this at length in the lesson, and you'd have come up with how the data on the table supports the data used to produce the choropleth map. You'd have identified regions of the United Kingdom where you do have a rising, increasing population, and also focused down on areas where the population increase wasn't as high. So, for example, the northeast of England there, where you've only got 2.8% increase, compared to the southeast and London, southeast where you've got 8.7% increase, and London with a 13.8% increase. So here are some summary points that we then brought in. Looking at the reasons why places such as London and the southeast have a higher percentage increase. The ethnic mix in London is higher, 30.6% Asian or Asian British. Rural areas have a higher percentage of white British, 93.2%. And if you look down at the Tower Hamlets, there's an anomaly to this, as significantly off average for England and Wales. There's a clear pattern with the growth in the southeast of the UK. It shows it is the most desirable location of our country. And as I said before, the lowest increase was in the northeast at 2.8%. And that suggests there's issues, as no one wants to move there, or very few people want to move there. And could be there's a lower fertility rate as well in comparison to London. So you then looked at this graph. Again, it's a very simple graph showing UK population growth forecast 2010 to 2030. This graph goes back to 1970 to begin with, but then from 2010 to 2030, it was a forecast. And then you completed these stages of explanation Well, you'd have started by saying, I think the population in 2030 will be, you'd have put a prediction. My reason for this prediction is, so you're developing an explanation. The biggest reason for this growth will be, so narrowing it down to the biggest cause of population growth. And then thinking ahead, this could lead to problems such as. So that box that's just appeared there, you'd have discussed this. So August 2010, the UK population forecast is to grow to 70.5 million by 2030, from 62.2 million of mid 20 to 13.3% increase. Then we'd have set you this homework, and this was to again look in detail at this choropleth map. So you had a website to access using the neighbourhood statistics website, which is a really good website to get data from, and other sources. You created a fact file on why the northeast of England has the slowest population growth in the UK. Then you'd have gone to the textbook. So again, as part of your revision, go back to the textbook to remind yourself. You'd have got some more detailed notes on pages 276 to 277 of the Geography 1 book, the Hodder book itself. So the next part of inquiry question 1 was then looking at rural to urban population changes. So 3 levels here. Explain what problems are faced by urban and rural areas. Compare the challenges faced in rural and urban areas, and then to suggest strategies to solve these challenges both in urban and rural. And really this carries across 2 or 3 lessons. So you just started by looking at some population pyramids, which you would have looked at GCSE, but obviously delved into more detail here at A level. And you'd have done a simple matching exercise where you've got different population pyramids for different places. You didn't know where they were, and obviously they're different shapes. And at the top right, you've got the categories there that you needed to apply to each of those population pyramids. So population pyramid 1, where you've got your typical wide base, narrows towards the top, typical developing country pyramid. And that was actually the population pyramid for Uganda. If you looked at the second one, again, this is still a developing country population pyramid with a wide base there, slightly wider middle, narrowing at the top. That is very characteristic of a developing rural area in a developing country, and this was the region of Bihar. Then you move into the right-hand side, you're looking at the developed country population pyramid, and in this case, this was Japan's, where you have a narrowing base, a much wider middle to your population pyramid, and an increasing number of people towards the top of the pyramid. Then, population pyramid 4, again, is looking at a developing country area, but this time looking at an urban part of a developing country. The bottom middle, very odd shape there. You can see you've got the bottom age group, the 0 to 4 age group, is increasing, but previous to that, it was much lower, and then you had an increase again. So there's some bulges in this pyramid. Now, this is London. This is a developed urban area such as London, and you'd have explored the reasons for that shape. And then finally, a very sporadic pyramid there, looking at the developed rural area, and that was actually West Devon. You can see there's been some major changes over the years. So that introduced this next part. So we looked at some background to begin with, and we stated that urban and rural areas have their own characteristics. They are different. They're different in population size. They're different in education levels. So we'd have, throughout this part of the unit, we'd have started to explore those differences. And the population found in urban areas is different to that in rural areas for a range of reasons. So we'd have then discussed the reasons for the changes in those characteristics, looking at income, education, employment, demographics. And before you looked at those issues and why they occur, we needed to understand the relationship between urban and rural. We see them as very separate in this they are, but they're very closely linked as well. And that's where you started to delve into this theory of the rural-urban continuum, created by Cloak in 1979. And you've got the model there itself. It is a geographical model. Now, don't forget, a model is a simplification of reality. It shows a pattern of how settlements change from one place to the other. Not all areas fit the model, though, and we'd have said that at the time. But a continuum is something that changes gradually over time to something different. So your task was to explain what this shows around the image that you were given, and then suggest reasons why the settlement types change. Why are they different? And the factors that underlie that. We then summarised this down after you'd made some detailed notes on this, and we've gone from the large conurbation. Now, conurbation technically is where you've got 2, 3, 4 large urban areas all merging together, right down to then you have your strip of greenbelt that often surrounds those cities to restrict outward migration of people and development and building, down to your small village, then your suburbanized village. Now, suburbanization is an important factor as part of the rural urban continuum. Um, you then looked at the remote village, the small suburbanized village, and then the village with mainly second homes. So they're all different sizes, different size population, different size settlements, and different distances away from that large city of conurbation. Now, again, then we delved into a bit of population pyramid practice again, looking at the United Kingdom population pyramid here, a much more simplified population pyramid, looking at the UK in 1960 when it had a population of 51 million, and then the difference in 2016 when it had a population of 65 million. And you can see the changing in shape there of the pyramid, getting much more older people at the top. You're starting to get an increase in the male and female population over the age of 80. You start to get a narrowing, a slimming down of the pyramid. So we'd have then start to look at the structure of the UK. So population structure of the United Kingdom, you'd have discussed this. How do you think the pattern of structure varies across rural and urban? Looking at the rural urban fringe as well. You'd have discussed, and this is very stereotypical here, you'd have discussed who the average Joe is in, first of all, London, the age of the person, the employment status of the person, the ethnic makeup of the person. Looking at a northern city of the UK, looking at a rural area in the north, a rural area in the south near London, and then the Scottish Highlands. Because the average person living in these different areas of the United Kingdom are very different in terms of their ethnic makeup, their age, their job status, and so on. And you do have to be careful with generalizations because there are variations between people in different areas for different reasons. Now, we then looked at a bit of an anomaly here. We went over to Kenya and we looked at Kenya's population structure as a developing country. So you looked at the urban and rural areas of Kenya as a developing country. You looked at the contrast between these areas in the developing country of Kenya and how extreme they are, looking at the extreme levels of poverty and wealth found alongside each other in a country like Kenya. And then your task was to complete a worksheet looking at Kenya with 3 activities based on the information and figures. So you'd got a lot of data from Kenya and you'd have deconstructed their population. And what you'd have then done as part of this is look at the 3 biggest issues in rural Kenya, and you'd have identified the climate with extreme droughts and extreme rainfall leading to floods and destruction of crops. You'd have looked at the healthcare, looking at AIDS and HIV rates in particular are still high because people cannot afford treatment. And then looking at access to clean water as the third big issue in rural Kenya. But then looking at the biggest 3 issues in urban Kenya, the biggest being corruption, unemployment, 40% finish school in a city but can't get a job. And then looking at the quality of housing. So therefore, looking at a country such as Kenya, looking at the differences between that rural urban continuum and the 2 different areas and the different issues that often appear in rural and urban areas. You'd have then explored this exam question. So, for a named developing country, explain how challenges facing population vary between rural and urban areas. Now, you'd have either answered this in the lesson or you'd have done it at home. So, you'd have given yourself 10 minutes. We didn't give you any total marks for this one because we really want you to explore this in your own way, and then we'd have marked it together. Um, we did give some prizes at the time, often in the form of sweets, if you remember. Now, I added this bit in because I felt we needed to explore this population structure of the UK in a lot more detail. In particular, looking at the demographic transition model, which you would have studied in GCSE. You must apply this to the United Kingdom and population structure as part of diverse places. So I gave you a graph such as this, the exact same graph, looking from 1953 up to 2013, and very simply showing the births and the deaths. The births being your blue dashed line, and your deaths being the red solid line. And it's a very different looking demographic transition model because it's particular for the UK. So we asked you to annotate this transition model for the UK, trying to identify the changes, the patterns, the periods of time that would have appeared where there are clear changes in both deaths and births. Now, what we looked at was, first of all, this chunk here, where this is showing natural increase. In other words, population growth. And you can clearly see there, that's a period of time from around about 1953 up to around about 1974, 75, maybe 76, where we had births being higher than deaths. So your population was growing in the United Kingdom during that period of time. And also this chunk here, again, from around about 1977 right the way up to 2013, again was a period of natural increase where your population was growing due to births being higher than deaths. Then we focus down on the births itself. And you can see here from 1953, 54, up to around about 1964, we had a rising birth rate in the United Kingdom. And we put that down to a baby boom, the post-war baby boom, where lots of babies were being born because obviously 1939 to 1945 was the war, but the baby boom period continued into the 1950s. We then looked at the decrease in the birth rate from 1964 to 1967. We did have a falling birth rate. That's probably because the baby boom was over. People had had children, and they delayed having more children or didn't have any more at all because children are expensive. We then looked at this period of time here from 1978 to 1990, where we had a slight rise in the birth rate. And then from 1990 to 2002, we had a falling birth rate again. So there's over the period of time, we've had rises, we've had falls, and many reasons lie behind this. We talked about the baby boom from 1953 to 64 being a reason after the war. Now, during the 60s and 70s, there were mini baby booms as well. We had downturns in an economy, which would have decreased the birth rate because people didn't have enough money to afford to have children. Then we'd have had improvements in the economy. People got better jobs. People start to have more children. And then much more recently, looking at 2002 to 2013, again, we had a rising birth rate. Now, the death rate, there's very little you can say about it really because it's fairly consistent from 1952 up to 2013. And that's because medical hospitals, medicines, life expectancy was increasing over the time. So the death rate, though, you can see started to decrease probably from around about the mid 80s, a slow decrease in death rate right up to 2013, but not a major decrease. So there's fairly consistent improvements in healthcare with a slight reduction in death rates. Oh, that's what I've said there. Slight decrease in death rates from 1984 onwards. And that was the year I was born. Now, then I want you to delve into this in a more detail because immigration and emigration rates in the UK are a factor that does impact on the UK population. Now, what you'd have looked at, also, apologies, what you'd have looked at here is three pieces of data. The red line shows immigration, people moving into the UK from 1991 up to 2014. Emigration is people leaving United Kingdom from 1991 to 2014. And then the net migration, that's the difference between the two. Now, if you look at the net migration to begin with, the bars, you can see there has been, over time, the general trend is a gradual increase in net migration to the UK, in the UK from 1991 to 2014. But there has been periods of time where there's been a reduction in that net migration, an increase in that net migration, and there's many, many factors we would have explored to answer that. And that led us very nicely onto the next part of EQ1, which is looking at migration, but then looking at mortality and fertility and how these factors affect the population structure and the dynamics of a country such as the UK. So you'd have explained how demographics of an area can change over time. You'd have compared how areas are changing. And then you'd have suggested long-term impacts of changes to those demographics. So here we'd have gone down to look at the generalized demographic transition model, the model that's used across the world to explain the stages through which countries travel. And you'd have looked at the demographic transition model, you'd have reminded yourself from GCSE what it means and the different stages and the reasons for changes in birth rate and death rate and total population. But really, the three big things here is, why is it called the demographic transition model? Well, demography is the study of population, transition is the changing that population. It shows the development of a country over time, and it clearly shows the changes in birth and death rates. So what you'd have then been given was a set of development indicator figures, and I'll show that on the next slide in a minute. And using that development data, you'd have been given the task to predict where each country will sit on this development spectrum, moving from the least developed country right up to the most developed. And there's that set of data. I actually grabbed this from a lesson at GCSE. There's no point in reinventing the wheel. So you had a variety of countries down the left-hand side. Some by their names you can see are very rich, very poor, some are in the middle, and then a range of development indicator data for you to use to place them on that particular spectrum. What you'd have then done is delve into these two indicators: fertility rate for these sets of countries and mortality rate. Now, fertility rate being the average number of babies a woman has in that country, and mortality rate really is the death rate, if you like, number of people that die on average per 1,000 people. So, countries there, and what I'd have asked you to do was rank them. Rank those countries in terms of the fertility rate. So, really, the higher the fertility rate, the less developed the country tends to be. So you can see there a fertility rate for Uganda of 5.8 is pretty high. On average, a woman is having 5.8 children. Now that is still pretty high in our world today. So that would have probably been ranked as the last country. And the lowest fertility rate there is Latvia with 1.5. Very interesting. You wouldn't expect that. But then if you look at, and Latvia would have been ranked 1 because it's having less children. But the mortality rate, have a look at this, slightly different. The country that has the highest mortality rate is Latvia. So that would therefore, based on mortality rate, would have been ranked last as the least developed of those nations. And really the point we were trying to get across here was you cannot use one set of data to rank a country in terms of its development. You have to use a range of data. And here I would have introduced the Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index, for, if you remember back to GCSE, looks a range of different indicator figures, social and economic together, and comes up with a ranking from 0 to 1. The closer a country is to 0, the poorer or least developed it is. The closer it is to 1, the richer or more developed the country is. And if you look at that same set of countries there, I mean, look at Latvia, 46th in the world. The lowest ranking there, again, is Uganda, so that made sense. But the highest country is Norway. But you wouldn't have picked that up from the fertility and mortality rates on its own. So you've got to use ranges of data to make those decisions. And the United Nations tend to prefer the HDI scale. Now, again, we'd have looked at the population pyramids of 2015, and using the information provided, you'd have annotated the population pyramid in more detail, and you'd have looked at different age groups. And what we then moved into was looking at cultural characteristics, because the cultural characteristics of a country, of different regions of a country, do vary. So we'd have looked at, what does cultural mean? So how do we define culture? And then also, what is a characteristic? And we'd have put the two together. So we'd have come up with this. You'd have watched 2 YouTube clips here, so re-watch those. So culture is the complex whole which includes a range of different things, and you wouldn't have known this: knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by a person as a member of society. That is culture. Now, characteristics are a feature or quality belonging typically to a person, a place, or a thing, and it identifies whatever it is. We'd have then put the two together. So cultural characteristics are the features of an area and the people living in that area in terms of their beliefs, their knowledge, and their habits. So we then pose this question: what areas can you think of with really strong cultural characteristics? And this is across the world. And I did want you to be stereotypical here. And we then looked at these examples, and many of you wouldn't have remembered Only Fools and Horses with that top left image, looking at a particular area of London called Peckham, very poor area of London, where people tended to have particular characteristics, part of their culture. We looked at Steve Irwin there, the typical Australian cultural characteristics. We looked at the Japanese, because the Japanese have a very distinct cultural characteristic. So these were very stereotypical. And then we looked at what can affect cultural characteristics of an area or a location, in particular in the UK. And there's many different reasons we looked at. We looked at ethnic background, and in particular regarding ethnic background, migrants to the UK tend to have a higher fertility rate because they tend to be younger. We looked at mortality rate, recreational facilities, housing standards, education, migration, and income. Now, these are the big parts, the biggest reasons that impact on cultural characteristics of an area. So if we look at the ethnic background first, born in the UK but with parents born abroad. So that does have an impact on the cultural makeup of an area. Migrants to an area, we get what we call a cultural transfer, a change in the culture of the area. It becomes more multicultural. And that in itself brings many other changes. Now, if we look at the fertility rates, that's heavily linked to culture and ethnicity. The cultural background of a person can impact on the fertility rate. Often when we get migrants coming to a city such as Yangon, they tend to be younger people, and they will have more children. The fertility rate for those people will be higher. Then you get people being born into a culture. They're born into a country such as the UK, but they're born into a particular culture within the UK, which will then impact upon them positively as they go through life. So in some cultures and religions, people are respected more if they have more children, resulting in an increased birth rate. And that still is the case in some parts of some religions. Then the mortality rate. So the diet of different cultures impact upon the mortality rate. The original inhabitants dying, leaving less of a cultural mix impacts on the characteristics of an area. And then looking at the recreational facilities. Now, recreational facilities, leisure facilities in particular areas often attract younger people. That's why cities and large towns tend to attract younger people because there's more on offer for them. You get more of a vibrancy added to the culture of an area when you have younger people moving there. Looking at the housing stock, in certain places, there's not enough. So if there's not enough housing stock, the supply isn't there, the demand increases. That increases the price. That means wealthier people are attracted to areas where there is a decrease in the housing stock. If we look at areas with poor quality housing, so some inner city areas maybe, if the housing isn't as good, the price of the housing will be cheaper. That will attract lower paid workers and some immigrants, because when immigrants come here, they can't always afford the higher house prices in certain areas. We then looked at education. So if you've got areas which have a good and outstanding schools in the area, there's a higher demand by parents. That becomes a more successful area. House prices will increase. It changes the culture of the area. If you've got mixed comprehensives, the learning experience are different in different cultural backgrounds. You will get more integration. If you have a mixed area, you'll get integration of students together from different ethnicities and cultures and backgrounds, and that's a good thing. We then look to migration, looking at the diversity that migration can bring to an area. The integration again, the increasing cultural mix of the area due to migration. Then income. Sorry, I should have mentioned segregation can be caused as a result of migration. That was for a future lesson. And then looking at the language mix, particularly in schools, looking at English as an additional language. Then moving on to income, we looked at higher incomes, attracts more facilities. So if you've got people living in an area that earn more money in general, that will attract more investment and more facilities. That increases prices further. That then you experience gentrification in some of these areas. So we really did explore a range of different factors that influence the cultural characteristics of an area or location in the United Kingdom. Then you would have a homework to do, and it was to create a case study of how migration has affected the cultural characteristics of Luton. And there was a reason for this, because Luton we really did delve into great depth. And then we'd have finished with a discussion looking at, in pairs, 3 minutes to prepare an argument that migration, fertility, and mortality rate are having a bigger effect on either the cultural characteristics or the population structure. Now, this is where we've spent 3 or 4 lessons, and very important we did so, because this makes up half of inquiry question 1, where all that you'd learnt in inquiry question 1 we had to start to apply to a local place. Your local place is Shefford. So if you ever get a question in diverse places about your local place, it's Shefford. And a contrasting place, which is Luton. So if you ever asked about an essay question about a local and contrasting place you have studied, it is Luton and Shefford. Now, what you'd have done was identify and describe the population characteristics of Luton and Shefford and the differences and why there's differences. You'd have compared those characteristics, and then you'd have analysed why population characteristics differ in Shefford and Luton. Now, what I'm going to go through here are the tables of data and the worksheets that you'd have completed at the time. So if you feel you're lacking any data, the website that you'd have used to get a lot of this was DataShine, and go back to DataShine and have a look. So we'd have first have looked at this. What leads to a multicultural society? What pull factors might attract ethnic groups to certain areas? We looked at what multicultural meant. We then before we really delved into this, looked at what do you think Shefford's population makeup is like? So we asked you, what do you think the age structure was, the gender structure, the ethnicity structure, and education levels. And this is where we got you into DataShine. And DataShine is a really good data analysis tool which allows you to explore different areas by postcode. And we just had a general look together on the board. We looked at Luton and we looked at the urban area of Luton, LU1 to LJ, and we compared it to Shefford, looking at SG175QS, which is actually the postcode of the school. So we found the maps for those two areas, we'd explored the areas and looked at how to use data shine. And then I also used an example of Liverpool here. And you can see from these screenshots here, on the left-hand side, we were looking at the sex makeup of the area. So the highest percentage of males live in the city centre of Luton. You can see that from the dark greens. And on data sign, you can hover over the different areas to get the exact data. And then moving outwards towards the outskirts of Luton, so the darker red areas, you had a lower percentage of males. And then on the right-hand side, it was looking at ethnic groupings, where the darker red and the orange yellow, the outskirts of the city see the highest proportion of white residents, whereas the inner city areas of Liverpool, tended to have more of an ethnic mix, or a lower number of white people living there. So what we then did was complete activity. So explain the population characteristics of each area, compare the gender makeup, and suggest 3 reasons. So we looked at the general causes of change in rural and urban areas and brainstorm those, and that's when we started to delve into Luton and Shefford. So here's the range of data that I gave you to start with. So Luton and Shefford, we looked at the population structure, the general structure of age categories in both areas. So there we had the population data for Luton. Now Luton's will be more detailed because there's more people and it's a borough of its own, whereas Shefford is part of central Bedfordshire. So it's a bit vaguer for Shefford, but we broke it down. And what I did for you is break it down into age categories of 0 to 15, 16 to 64, and then 65 plus. So please go back over the differences in population structure between Luton and Shefford, because there clearly is a difference. Then looked at the ethnicity makeup of both Luton and Shefford. Now again, Shefford, not as much breakdown because it's not as ethnically diverse. And what you're interested in there for the Shefford one is where it said this ward, the number and the percentage. So you can see there in Shefford, 7.1% are non-white British in Shefford, which is very, very low. Compare that to Luton, very, very different. You then looked at unemployment of Luton and Shefford and the differences in the unemployment rate. So you're looking for Shefford, the Shefford ward. So the Shefford ward unemployment rate is 4.8%, whereas in Luton, it's 5.6%. So more people in Luton are unemployed. And again, we'd have explored the reasons for why Luton has more unemployed compared to Shefford. And one of the reasons links very closely to educational standards. So you then looked at the educational outcomes of people in both Luton and Shefford and how they differ. Then you'd have had tables to complete using Data Shine and also other websites as well that give good data. So here you'd have looked at, this one says Luton, but you've done exactly the same for Shefford. So for Luton, you'd have looked at Data Shine to look at the households by deprivation. And then I asked you to look at the origins and beliefs of both Luton and Shefford. So the ethnic group makeup of white people, the country of birth, looking at the European destinations people came from, looking at the Middle East and Asian nations where people have come from, looking at the main language, English, then looking at the religion, Christianity, and the Muslim makeup of both Luton and Shefford. Looking at health, so the general health, looking at the number of people in very good health in Luton and Shefford. Housing, looking at the number of people living in a one-bedroom accommodation in both Luton and Shefford. Back to education again, looking at Luton and Shefford, where the highest level of qualification is level 2 qualification, so GCSE or equivalent. And then looking at the highest level of qualification being an apprenticeship. Looking at employment in Luton and Shefford, so the number of hours worked, so full time. Then looking at residency in both Luton and Shefford, so the year of arrival of people in the UK, born in the UK. Looking at people who arrived between 2004 and 2006. Then you could see 2007 to 2009, then 2010 to 2011. Then looking at the age of arrival in the UK. So the age of arrival in the UK for people aged 16 to 17, then 18 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29. Again, looking at that for Luton and Shefford. Now, then we looked at external influences contributing to place identity. Again, both your local being Shefford and Luton being your contrasting urban place. So what we'd have discussed in lesson and made lots of notes on was social clustering in Luton. And is there any? Well, yes, there is. You'd have picked that up from the data. Why was there social clustering in Luton? And then looking at the same for Shefford, much more trickier, because how can you tell if there's social clustering in Shefford when there's actually not much variety in the data? So we'd have looked at a particular area of Shefford where we could have classed there was social clustering and why. We'd have looked at the accessibility of Luton and Shefford. How accessible is Luton to people from outside of Luton? And then the same for Shefford. And we'd have looked at particular examples of accessibility, so train stations, bus routes, motorways, road networks. The physical factors of both locations, the physical factors of Luton, so the lie of the land, and also in Shefford. And then the government planning policy for Luton, so and also Shefford. So does government planning and local government council policies impact upon Luton and the cultural diversity, and then the same for Shefford? Then we delved into regional and national influences on both Luton and Shefford. So you can see there, broke the table down into two parts, the same questions for both locations. So looking at your regional influences column first, we'd have looked at how well is Luton and Shefford connected in terms of transport, and we'd identified the differences. Are there major cities nearby? And what is their impact on Luton and Shefford? And then what are Luton and Shefford's council's policies on growth and development? And then national influences, looking at the country as a whole. So how is Luton directly affected by specific government policies or designations? And the same for Shefford. How does Luton compare with national averages of wealth and deprivation? And again, the same for Shefford. And then how accessible is Luton to London and other leading UK cities? And again, the same for Shefford. And then we look at the international and global influences upon Luton and Shefford. Now, obviously, there are a lot more international and global influences upon Luton than there is Shefford. So that's why your Luton chump was bigger in your notes. So for both locations, are any global brands present in Luton? Retail outlets, branch factories and offices? And you identified, yes, there was from your research. And we looked in particular at the Armdale Shopping Centre in the centre of Luton and the different outlets and transnational companies that are present in Luton. But for Shefford, you clearly identified not as many. There was only one I think you identified as Domino's. And then is Luton involved in any form of global tourism? And the same for Shefford. Now, funnily enough, Luton is, because it's got an airport. So we'd have discussed that. You'd have made some notes on that. And Luton trying to present itself as a place to visit. Shefford, though, not really. And then how well connected to the internet is Luton and Shefford? And we'd have looked at internet speeds. Now here is where we looked at the internal influences contributing to place identity. Again, for both Luton and Shefford. So for Luton and Shefford, you'd have looked at the architectural reminders of the past. So how many old buildings are there? What were the old buildings in Luton and Shefford? What is the extent of open space in Luton compared to Shefford? What is the population density like for Luton and Shefford? What is the population structure? Now, we'd already looked at that. the fertility rate, the ethnic mix. How would you describe the social economic tone of Luton? That's a very tricky one. And also Shefford. Is there residential segregation in both Luton and Shefford? And then does Luton and Shefford have a specific identity? That's where we brought everything together to say, okay, how would we describe the identity of people living in Luton? And how would we do the same for people living in Shefford? And there we go. There's the same questions there for Shefford. What we then did was we rounded the whole series of 3 to 4 lessons off with this 6 marker, and this was to ease you in. How does the size of a settlement affect its population characteristics? Because it's clearly different. Luton is a much different size to Shefford. Now, a bit of general advice here. Oh, sorry, here we go. Let's do this first. So we'd have looked at how does the size of settlement affect its population characteristics, and we'd have looked at the reasons for that. What I've then done is I'd have advised you very clearly on how this could be used in your exam. Now, for the diverse places section of your exam paper, paper 2, you will get a 20-mark essay question. Now, we can't say for sure that that is definitely going to be on your local and contrasting place, but it could well be. And they could pick any aspect, if we go back through these, of internal influences, international and global influences, regional influences, national influences, external influences, any aspects of those they could pick upon for you to compare between your local and contrasting places. So you do need to know Luton and Shefford inside out with the clear comparisons, the clear similarities, the clear differences, and the reasons why there are differences and similarities between the two local and contrasting places. So that rounds off inquiry question 1. Again, please go back over this. Look very carefully at all of the different parts of the unit and then how this links into inquiry question 2. Thank you very much.